the demilitarization and denazification.
Underground metro stations. In total, Ukraine says that so far at least 40 military personnel have been killed, alongside at least 10 civilians. Ukraine also says that it has shot down 6 Russian military aircraft. Moscow has denied those claims. Mariam, verified information from what is happening on the ground, as well as videos from the scene, is still difficult to ascertain. But I do want to show you this video that was recently uploaded by Ukrainian territory. And it does appear to back those claims that they have indeed shot down at least 1 Russian military aircraft. This video being uploaded and shared by Ukraine's defense forces. We heard from Russian President Vladimir Putin that he wanted to denazify Ukraine. But his words have also been taken by his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that what Russia has done to Ukraine on Thursday is nothing short than what Nazi Germany did during the Second World War.
OK, Matthew, thank you so much for that update. Thank you so much. Well, joining me now is Bruno Lette, who's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Mr. Lette, thank you so much for being on the programme tonight. Now, we've seen the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen labelling the invasion as the gravest act on European soil in decades. But do you think they saw this coming? And if so, why do they not act stronger? Do you think that these sanctions have been enough?
I think everyone had a sense of things coming, but perhaps no one wanted to believe it, that it would happen, because it did seem so irrational from a Western perspective. But indeed, these acts are now happening, and indeed, as you said, the President of the European Commission called it the darkest hour. So far, we saw strong condemnation from all European capitals. So clearly, it seemed that the war has caused a shockwave across European capitals. What people thought would not be possible is actually happening. And this indeed, comes to European capitals and Brussels as a shock, that's for sure.
Well, let's come to the idea of European democracy and Europe's standing in the world then. Because in the days and weeks leading up to this, we saw the German Chancellor and the French President both go to Moscow. So do you think that Putin has essentially made them look a little bit foolish?
Look, I think what we need to realize is that, whether Putin will succeed in his objectives or will not succeed in his objectives is still an open question. One thing Putin did succeed to do, and it is to challenge the credibility of the West. I think we need to have a mea culpa among ourselves and realize that perhaps we failed as Western civilization to deter aggression and to uphold a liberal order that we ourselves had created in the 90s. So the rules of the game that we created ourselves are now being eroded in front of our eyes. And it is not just now that they are having been eroded.
Okay, we're going to have to sadly interrupt you there, because we are now going to go live to the UK House of Commons, where UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is speaking.
Earlier today, President Putin delivered another televised address and offered the absurd pretext that he sought the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. In fact, he is hurling the might of his military machine against a free and peaceful neighbour in breach of his own explicit pledge and every principle of civilized behaviour between states, spurning the best efforts of this country and our allies to avoid bloodshed. For this, Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands. And although the UK and our allies tried every avenue for diplomacy until the final hour, I'm driven to conclude that Putin was always determined to attack his neighbour, no matter what we did. Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest. I am proud that Britain did everything within our power to help Ukraine prepare for this onslaught, and we will do our utmost to offer more help as our brave friends defend their homeland. Our embassy took the precaution on 18th of February of relocating from Kiev to the city of Lviv, in Western Ukraine, where our ambassador Melinda Simmons continues to work with the Ukrainian authorities and to support British nationals. Now we have a clear mission. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbarous venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. At the G7 meeting this afternoon, we agreed to work in unity to maximize the economic price that Putin will pay for his aggression. And this must include ending Europe's collective dependence on Russian oil and gas that has served to empower Putin for too long. So I welcomed, again, Chancellor Scholz's excellent decision to halt the certification of Nord Stream 2. Mr. Speaker, countries that together comprise about half the world economy are now engaged in maximising pressure, economic pressure, on one that makes up a mere 2%. For our part today, the UK is announcing the largest and most severe package of economic sanctions that Russia has ever seen. With new financial measures, we're taking new powers to target Russian finance, in addition to the banks we've already sanctioned this week. Today, in concert with the United States, we are imposing a full asset freeze on VTB. More broadly, these powers will enable us totally to exclude Russian banks from the UK financial system, which is, of course, by far the largest in Europe, stopping them from accessing sterling and clearing payments through the UK. And with around half of Russia's trade currently in US dollars and sterling, I'm pleased to tell the House that the United States is taking similar measures. These powers will also enable us to ban Russian state and private companies from raising funds in the UK, banning dealing with their securities and making loans to them. We will limit the amount of money that Russian nationals will be able to deposit in their UK bank accounts, and sanctions will also be applied to Belarus for its role in the assault on Ukraine. Overall, we'll be imposing asset freezes on more than 100 new entities and individuals, on top of the hundreds that we've already announced. This includes all the major manufacturers that support Putin's war machine. Furthermore, we are also banning Aeroflot from the UK. Next, on top of these financial measures and in full concert with the United States and the EU, we will introduce new trade restrictions and stringent export controls similar to those that they in the US are implementing. We will bring forward new legislation to ban the export of all dual-use items to Russia, including a range of high-end and critical technological equipment and components in sectors including electronics, telecommunications, and aerospace. Legislation to implement this will be laid early next week. These trade sanctions will constrain Russia's military, industrial, and technological capabilities for years to come. We're bringing forward measures on unexplained wealth orders from the Economic Crime Bill to be introduced before the House rises for Easter. And we will set out further detail before Easter on the range of policies to be included in the full bill in the next session, including on reforms to Companies House and a register of overseas property ownership. We will set up a new dedicated kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency to target sanctions evasion and corrupt Russian assets hidden in the UK, and that means oligarchs in London will have nowhere to hide. And Mr. Speaker, I know that this House will have great interest in the potential of cutting Russia out from SWIFT. And I can confirm, as I've always said, that nothing is off the table. But for all these measures to be successful, it is vital that we have the unity of our partners, the unity in the G7 and other fora. And, Mr. Speaker, Russian investors are already delivering their verdict on the wisdom of Putin's actions. And so far today, Russian slots are down by as much as 45%, wiping $250 billion from their value in the biggest one-day decline on record. Sberbank, Russia's biggest lender, is down by as much as 45%, and Gazprom down by as much as 39%, while the ruble has plummeted to record lows against the dollar. We will continue on a remorseless mission to squeeze Russia from the global economy piece by piece, day by day, and week by week. And we will, of course, use Britain's position in every international forum to condemn the onslaught against Ukraine, and we will counter the Kremlin's blizzard of lies and disinformation by telling the truth about Putin's war of choice and his war of aggression. And we will work with our allies on the urgent need to protect other European countries that are not members of NATO and who could become targets of Putin's playbook of subversion and aggression. And we will resist any creeping temptation to accept what Putin is doing today as a fait accompli. There can be no creeping normalization. Not now, not in the months to come, not in the years ahead. We must strengthen NATO's defences still further. And so today I called for a meeting of NATO leaders, which will take place tomorrow, and I will be convening the countries that contribute to the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is led by the United Kingdom and comprises both NATO and non-NATO members. Last Saturday, I warned that this invasion would have global economic consequences, and this morning the oil price has risen strongly. The government will do everything possible to safeguard our own people from the repercussions for the cost of living. And of course, we stand ready to protect our country from any threats, including in cyberspace. Above all, the House will realise the hard and heavy truth that we now live in a continent where an expansionist power, deploying one of the world's most formidable military machines, is trying to redraw the map of Europe in blood and conquer an independent state by force of arms. And it's vital for the safety of every nation that Putin's squalid venture should ultimately fail and be seen to fail. However long it takes, that will be the steadfast and unflinching goal of the United Kingdom. I hope of every member of this House and every one of our great allies, certain that together we have the power and the will to defend the cause of peace and justice as we have always done. And I say to the people of Russia, again, whose president has just authorized an onslaught against a fellow Slavic people, I cannot believe that this horror is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status that these actions will bring to the Putin regime. And to our Ukrainian friends, in this moment of agony, I say that we are with you and we are on your side. Your right to choose your own destiny is a right that the United Kingdom and our allies will always defend, and in that spirit, I join you in saying Slava Ukraini, and I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this dark hour, our thoughts, our solidarity and our resolve are with the Ukrainian people. Invading troops march through their streets. Missiles shell their cities.
OK, so that was the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking there in the House of Commons. Just to recap a little on what he did say, he said that Putin will stand condemned by the world and history. The Allies have tried all avenues of diplomacy, but Putin is determined. We will see him as a blood-stained dictator. So strong words there from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He said that the UK will do all that they can for Ukraine as Ukraine defends itself. They said that there's a clear mission economically, politically, and eventually militarily. He also talked about the virtual G7 summit. He said that we will match economic price Putin will pay, and the reliance on Russian oil and gas has to stop. Well, now let's go back to Bruno Lette, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, for analysis on what the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said in the Commons there. Bruno, thanks for staying with us there. So we've heard from Boris Johnson there. He's talked about new UK, a range of new measures, oligarchs having nowhere to hide. Is this stronger now?
Sure. Well, we see actually a continued unity between the UK, the European Union, and the United States. So all these measures are obviously coordinated. Clearly, the West is opting for a path of sanctions, harsh sanctions, sanctions that might cripple the Russian economy. However, sanctions are a tool. They are not a policy to change behavior. Sanctions should be part of a larger policy. Sanctions rarely change behavior, and we've seen that so far sanctions have failed to change the behavior of Russia, of Vladimir Putin. We also should consider that sanctions only have a midterm or long-term effect. So they are not a short-term instrument. As right now people are dying in Ukraine, sanctions will not have an effect. So these are all things, of course, that we need to consider when we talk about sanctions. The duration of Western sanctions will also be critical, of course. How long will the West sustain this effort? We also need to envisage that Russia has likely prepared for these sanctions. It is well known that Russia has built a financial cushion through its national wealth fund. It has built a war chest to survive some time under a regime of sanctions. And we should, of course, also consider that Russia might be willing to retaliate against Western sanctions. So how much are we prepared in the West to also pay a cost for the sanctions that we will impose on Russia? That, of course, now is the key question.
But let's come to Boris Johnson's speech itself. Do you think it was a bold speech? He talked about it was a clear mission economically, politically, and eventually militarily. What do you think he means by that, militarily?
I think it's, of course, very important now to make bold statements because the situation is very grave. When we talk about military actions, it is unclear what that means. From a NATO perspective, it is clear that NATO, so far has not indicated any willingness to be actively militarily engaged. So far, we have also not received signals from London or from any other Western capital, frankly speaking, what military engagement may mean. There are also perceptions that the West would not want to be military engaged in Ukraine. There doesn't seem to be support among capitals so far for such move. But, rather than to think about boots on the ground, maybe what we could envisage is that there might be a military cyber response. Perhaps the West might engage in cyber attacks, harming Russian infrastructure that is critical to the country. That might be a military response as well. We don't necessarily need to think about land, sea, or air. There are other domains as well in this respect.
But do you think that Boris Johnson, in his language and what he was saying, he was very strong, but he was also, in part, a little bit non-committal? Especially when it comes to what potentially these further sanctions could be.
No, well, of course, we also need to envisage there's just that much that the West can do. If your policy is based on sanctions, this is, in the end, a fairly limited tool. Also, what Boris Johnson said is, it's all basically retaliating against Russia. What I didn't hear, for instance, in the speech is, what will the UK do, for instance, to help Ukraine directly? So, of course, we are helping Ukraine by retaliating against Russia. I don't deny that. But, what can we do directly for Ukraine as well? I haven't heard that, for instance. And this is, of course, a more difficult question to answer.
So what do you think that they should be doing for Ukraine, then, in your opinion?
To be frank, it seems that leaders want to limit their response to the sanctions, to the economic and political response. Even for instance, so far the West was delivering weapons to Ukraine, capabilities to help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Now such options seems more difficult to do. The Ukrainian airspace is also invaded, so it's not like you can just send an airplane to Ukraine with weapons to help the country. So that option is also quite limited in that respect. So I think that the only response we will see will be economically and politically, at least from a short-term perspective.
And just a final last question on Russia. Boris Johnson, of course, he did say that Russia is being squeezed. Is it going to have that effect on President Putin?
Well, there's no doubt the sanctions will hurt Russia. I mean, when we hear the amount of measures that are being taken, this will squeeze Russia. But again, not in an immediate effect. This effect will take a midterm, long-term perspective. For instance, I want to remind again that Russia's national wealth fund is now at a record high, estimated at $171 billion these days. So you can well imagine that Russia does have a financial cushion to absorb the shock of Western sanctions. That's why I want to underline again the importance of the duration of the sanctions, because even national wealth funds doesn't survive forever. So in the mid to long term, I do believe, yes, Russia will be squeezed.
Yeah, and definitely sanctions and lengthy sanctions will definitely be important indeed. Bruno Lette, thank you so much for that analysis. Thank you so much. Well, we heard a few minutes ago from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He indicated that Britain could eventually support Ukraine militarily and repeated that Putin must not be allowed to succeed.
Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest. Now we have a clear mission, diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily. This hideous and barbarous venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Well, for more on the response from Boris Johnson, let's now go over to London, where Vincent McAvenny is live for us. So, Vincent, we really saw strong words there from Boris Johnson. Take us through again what he announced.
Boris Johnson was accused earlier in the week of being too light in the sanctions that he imposed, just 5 banks and 3 individuals. Well, he has gone much further than that, saying that there will be dozens of Russians here who will be facing sanctions, that there will be the support, as you've mentioned, given to the Ukrainians, even mentioning militarily. He'll be doing things like banning Aeroflot. There will be blocks in the UK's financial systems for Russian clearing as well. So it was a full raft of measures. There was obviously a liaison across the G7 earlier on in that meeting. We're about to get President Biden in a couple of minutes' time announcing similar sanctions to relieve Boris Johnson just did. So this was to come back to his many critics in the past few days who say that he didn't go hard enough, and he said nothing is off the table. There have been calls to take Russia out of the SWIFT international banking system at the moment. That is still not being activated, but you can see that might be in the next package. But for Boris Johnson now, someone who only decided on Brexit on a 50-50 flip, this is the first big test of what he said during that campaign, during all the last few years, was the benefit in international terms of Brexit, of Britain standing on its own, of imposing its own sanctions, of going its own way in the world, but still being a part of Europe and standing with Europe. And so he is trying to put that message out to the EU partners that the UK stands with them when it comes to their response to the aggression from Russia in Ukraine, and that we work with them because, of course, alongside France, we are the only other main nuclear army in the UK, in Europe, and we boast some of the biggest capacities. Particularly, I think that's mention that he made of military force. I think the UK's cybersecurity has been something that's developed rapidly in the past decade, and I think that is what he was alluding to with that comment, that there might be both defensive moves for Ukraine with the UK's cyber force, but also some offensive moves perhaps against Russia.
Now, Vincent, let's take it back a bit from what you were saying there, and let's talk about SWIFT. With Boris Johnson saying nothing is off the table, but still not, of course, committing there. Why do you think the UK is still not committing to that?
Well, we know that Boris Johnson had a number of financial chiefs of bank heads into Downing Street last night to talk them through what could be going on, what they could do, how they can help. I think there'll be massive pressure on all those UK banks. If you see behind me just there, that is Canary Wharf. Sorry, I'll turn the other way. That is Canary Wharf, which is the main financial centre of the UK now. All of those banks will be poring over their books, poring over their client lists, trying to find out who the Russians are. They'll be reviewing all of their all of the accounts that they have, the assets that they're holding here to see what it is that is on their books. And I think the problem that seems to be with SWIFT when you talk to banking experts is it might be a bit more complicated than simply, closing a door to Russia in a system. It's the system used by most of the world for banking. It's incredibly complex. And so there might need to be more time to figure out whether or not all of the effort to get Russia out of it will actually be effective.
Now, Vincent, there was a lot of course, criticism of the UK's first tranche.
Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest invasion of a neighboring country in Europe since World War II. The Russian military attacking from the south, the north, the east, taking out military installations and moving closer tonight.
Seven flanker. They completed the intercept to try to get in contact with the pilot, which proved to be cooperative, just asking to get on the shortest, in the shortest time on a suitable airfield for his aircraft. Romanian pilots took the decision to guide and to escort the Ukrainian aircraft on Bakou airfield, and the Ukrainian fighter was able to land uneventfully on Bakou.
Do you know why this pilot entered in NATO airspace?
We have no idea yet, so it's just a matter of our authorities to find out what happened exactly with the Ukrainian pilot.
We have a lot of tension these days in the Black Sea region. How busy are you in these days?
Definitely we are busier than normal this year, starting with the enforcement of the air forces, of NATO air forces on the eastern border of NATO and Romania. Our activity intensified a lot. We did initially in the first part of the month more than 10 missions to protect the airspace.
Early warning operations have increased.
Watch Euronews live and catch up with the latest news anytime, anywhere on Euronews.com and the Euronews app.
Our world is evolving faster than ever before. In this Euronews debate, our experts will discuss how to successfully regenerate a town or region. Join me, Damon Ebling, and our panelists live on Euronews.com.
Get the latest world news from Get all the international news you want at any time, anywhere on Euronews.com and the Euronews app.
Hello and welcome back. Right now we're showing you images of Independence Square in the center of Kiev. We'll also be showing you a map of exactly where the three fronts in which Russian forces have invaded the country. And we'll also be showing you images of different blasts that have been seen in Kiev. Overnight, reports came in that explosions were both seen and heard in the city. We can't actually know the true nature of those explosions yet, but according to AP, Russian forces are on the outskirts of the capital, and the U.S. reported that the capital could well be under siege. Russian forces have the Russian forces that are currently on the outskirts of the capital are estimated to be around 32 kilometers from Kiev. That's about 20 miles. Ukrainian's foreign minister said on Twitter that the explosions that did happen in Kiev were the worst attack on the city since World War II. Before this current update, and as Ukraine reported, the 137, actually how many people have been hurt in the capital, and 316 people in the country as a whole were wounded since Russia's invasion. Ukraine's Prime Minister Zelensky said that he and his family is going to remain in the capital despite the close proximity of the Russian forces. Since yesterday, many people have seen these images of people fleeing the capital, of traffic jams as far as the eye can see. An estimated 100,000 people have fled their homes in the country because of blasts and attacks and danger. Poland has created 8 reception centers for the people who have already managed to get across the border. These are images you can see to your right of an explosion in the distance in Kiev. Many journalists have reported that they've seen blasts in the city, even though Russia has said that they are not specifically targeting cities. Again, we don't actually know the nature of these blasts, but we do see some harrowing images that are coming through of exactly what's happening on the ground and overnight in Kiev. Again, these are some images that have been sourced from Kiev of people actually on the ground there. We'll be bringing you the latest updates from the capital and the country later throughout the day.
After a day of intense Russian attacks, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says at least 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed. There were explosions overnight around Kyiv, although it was impossible for reporters to confirm the origins. Zelensky also said his country felt alone in the fight. We're alone in defending our nation. Who's ready to fight with us? I don't see anybody. Who's ready to give Ukraine a guarantee to join NATO? Everyone is afraid. Ukraine also said Russian infiltrators are in the country. They confirmed Russia seized control of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and some reports say the soldiers are holding the zone's personnel as hostages.
This unlawful and dangerous hostage-taking, which could upend the routine civil service efforts required to maintain and protect the nuclear waste facilities, is obviously incredibly alarming and greatly concerning. We condemn it and we request their release.
In Kyiv and the West, many observers say they don't believe Vladimir Putin will limit his territorial ambitions to Ukraine, while admitting it's difficult to judge his ultimate intentions. Putin maintains he has no choice. What's happening right now are forced measures. We were left with no other way to proceed. But some reports say the Russian army is encountering more resistance than expected. Ukraine, after all, has been preparing for years. The government has ordered every man aged from 18 to 60 to remain in the country to defend the people.
Coming by road and rail, some of the first refugees from Ukraine arrived in Poland. These are some of the few hundred passengers from Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine that arrived in a Polish border town on Thursday.
We've actually been very lucky to get out of Ukraine with the second to last train that was coming here. We've spent last 16 hours using all of our luck coming here. Many people, many of our friends will get refugee status, but we are fortunate enough to have our accommodation planned, and we are very happy that we have our friends in Poland that are ready to help our people.
Poland has already set up at least 8 centers to greet the people streaming over the border, many of whom are from eastern Ukraine and are leaving the region because they fear for their safety. The centers that will greet them are already set up with places to rest, medical care, and food.
Tuesday, the 22nd of February, was a day of celebration in Donetsk and Luhansk. Residents in the two breakaway Ukrainian regions welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin's announcement that peacekeeping troops would be deployed to what Moscow now recognises as independent states.
I very hope on Russian troops. Without them, we can't fight with the Ukrainian army.
Russian-backed rebels have been fighting Kiev's forces since 2014 in a conflict that has killed over 14,000 people. But on Wednesday morning in a village a few kilometres from the front line, all was quiet when just days ago, the sounds of heavy shelling filled the air.
It should have been done earlier. Maybe it would have prevented the shooting. Look at all the destroyed houses.
While the US and its allies have announced a raft of sanctions in a final bid to deter the Kremlin from invading Ukraine, according to pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region, Moscow has come to their rescue. It's the biggest attack by one state against another in Europe since World War II, and EU leaders have been voicing their reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Nous appuierons l'Ukraine sans hésiter.
We will stand by Ukraine with no hesitation, and we will take all of the responsibility to protect the sovereignty and the security of our European allies.
Mes chers compatriotes,
my dear compatriots, the events of last night are a turning point in the history of Europe and of our country. They will have a long-term, deep effect on our lives.
Durable, profonde.
They will have consequences on the geopolitics of our continent,
sur la géopolitique,
and we will be able to give an answer all together.
Y répondre.
Moving east to Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz also voiced his support for his European counterpart in a national address.
The
24th of February is a terrible day for Ukraine and a dark day for Europe. With this attack on Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin is once again blatantly breaking international law.
Das Völkerrecht.
Putin is bringing suffering and destruction to his immediate neighbours. He's violating Ukraine's sovereignty and borders. He's endangering the lives of countless innocent people in Ukraine, Russia's brother nation. Ultimately, he's also calling into question the peaceful order of our continent. There is no justification for any of this. This is Putin's war.
Meanwhile, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson called Vladimir Putin a Russian dictator and said the UK is praying for Ukraine.
In concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. And to that end, we must also collectively cease the dependence on Russian oil and gas that for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics. Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Romanian pilots have been patrolling NATO airspace in the Black Sea, taking off from the Fătăi airbase on Thursday after Russia launched a full-scale invasion on Ukraine. The planes intercepted one Ukrainian fighter who was then escorted to the nearest airport. Euronews Romania journalist Adelan Peterizor spoke to the commander involved in the operation.
The QRA crew was scrambled to intercept an unidentified contact somewhere in the north of Romania. Our pilots applied the procedures, NATO and ICAO procedures. They did intercept and it proved to be, as you said, an Ukrainian Su-27 flanker. They completed the intercept to try to get in contact with the pilot, which proved to be cooperative, just asking to get on the shortest, in the shortest time on a suitable airfield for his aircraft. Romanian pilots took the decision to guide and to escort the Ukrainian aircraft on Bacău airfield, and the Ukrainian fighter was able to land uneventfully on Bacău.
Do you know why this pilot entered in NATO airspace?
We have no idea yet, so it's just a matter of our authorities to find out what happened exactly with the Ukrainian pilots.
We have a lot of tension these days in the Black Sea region. How busy are you in these days?
Definitely we are busier than normal this year, starting with the enforcement of the air forces, of NATO air forces on the eastern border of NATO and Romania. Our activity intensified a lot. We did initially in the first part of the month more than 10 missions to protect the airspace.
Early warning operations have increased dramatically for the pilots and are being carried out with other NATO forces. Germans have been flooding streets in Berlin, standing in solidarity with Ukrainians, denouncing Russia's full-scale invasion on Thursday. Shortly after news broke of the attack, demonstrations have been taking place at landmarks around the world as war now rages in Ukraine. Protesters say the international community needs to do more.
It's good that they finally put down Nord Stream 2, but I think there are more can do. And I think we have to discuss if we should send weapons to Ukraine. I don't understand why we haven't done it in the last weeks, actually.
Despite the international outcry and imposed sanctions, Russia's President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation overnight, changing the lives of thousands of Ukrainians now trying to flee. In Paris, residents and Ukrainian expatriates gathered in front of the Russian embassy there, including candidates for France's presidential election. In Poland, a country that borders Ukraine, more yellow and blue flags flew at rallies in Warsaw. Poland has already said it's preparing for an influx of Ukrainians trying to enter.
Get the latest world news from a European perspective.
Welcome back. Again, we're bringing you the latest updates from Kiev. What you're seeing on the image on the screen right now is the Independence Square. We'll be also showing you other images in this morning update. Overnight, explosions were seen and heard in Ukraine. In the capital of Ukraine. And according to AP, Russian forces are on the outskirts of the capital. The U.S. said that the U.S. reported that Kiev could well be under siege. What you're seeing on the right of the screen, that map shows the three points of entry in which Russia has invaded the country. The current forces that are reported near the capital came down from the Belarus border to Kiev. According to reports, they're about 32 kilometers from the capital, but that's the current reports, and that's around 20 miles from the capital. The blast that we're seeing in the city,
reports. Ukrainian officials have described them as rockets and missile fire. Though it is not, it's currently we can't confirm exactly what the explosions were. The Ukrainian army said that an estimated 3 people have already been injured in the city. And then in the country as a whole, before last night's updates, around 137 people were reportedly killed in the country. And that's the country as a whole, not Kiev. And 316 people were injured. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, said that he and his family will be staying in the capital, despite the reports of the approaching armies. What you can see to your right is another image of the horizon where there seems to be some form of fire. Russia has officially said that they are not attacking cities, but reports and images coming from the city, and even Ukrainian officials say that cities have been attacked. An estimated 100,000 people have already been displaced because of fighting. We've already seen images of traffic jams, people from yesterday trying to leave the city, people seeking shelter in the city because they couldn't actually leave. In Poland, we've already had reports of people and have seen people who have managed to leave Ukraine for Poland. Poland has already set up 8 reception centers for Ukrainian refugees entering the country. Hours after the initial Russian invasion,
After a day of intense Russian attacks, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says at least 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed. There were explosions overnight around Kyiv, although it was impossible for reporters to confirm the origins. Zelensky also said his country felt alone in the fight. We're alone in defending our nation. Who's ready to fight with us? I don't see anybody. Who's ready to give Ukraine a guarantee to join NATO? Everyone is afraid. Ukraine also said Russian infiltrators are in the country. They confirmed Russia seized control of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and some reports say the soldiers are holding the zone's personnel as hostages.
This unlawful and dangerous hostage-taking, which could upend the routine civil service efforts required to maintain and protect the nuclear waste facilities, is obviously incredibly alarming and greatly concerning. We condemn it and we request their release.
In Kyiv and the West, many observers say they don't believe Vladimir Putin will limit his territorial ambitions to Ukraine, while admitting it's difficult to judge his ultimate intentions. Putin maintains he has no choice. What's happening right now are forced measures. We were left with no other way to proceed. But some reports say the Russian army is encountering more resistance than expected. Ukraine, after all, has been preparing for years. The government has ordered every man aged from 18 to 60 to remain in the country to defend the people.
Coming by road and rail, some of the first refugees from Ukraine arrived in Poland. These are some of the few hundred passengers from Kharkiv, in eastern Ukraine, that arrived in the Polish border town on Thursday.
We've actually been very lucky to get out of Ukraine with the second to last train that was coming here. We've spent last 16 hours using all of our luck coming here. Many people, many of our friends will get refugee status, but we are fortunate enough to have our accommodation planned, and we are very happy that we have our friends in Poland that are ready to help our people.
Poland has already set up at least 8 centers to greet the people streaming over the border, many of whom are from eastern Ukraine and are leaving the region because they fear for their safety. The centers that will greet them are already set up with places to rest medical care, and food.
Christina is 32 years old. She's one of the evacuees that came to Russia from the self-proclaimed republics in the east of Ukraine that were recognized by Vladimir Putin. Christina came here with her 2 kids. Her husband stayed at home.
In the evening, when they started to get ready for the bus, we began to worry. But like Dad, why are we alone? Naturally, we're all anxious, all of our nerves. You want to cry, but it doesn't work because they are small children. What's next? We absolutely do not know anything, they said. Sit, wait, what to expect. We don't know. We want to go home. At least get ready to go now. How do you react to recognition? Well, of course, recognition is good. They will help us. Well, at least it can be over quick.
Local authorities accommodated 39 people in this hotel located near a gas station on the highway 60 kilometers from Rostov-on-Don. Ovsyannikova Irina lives here with her 9-year-old grandson Vladislav. She says she had to pack in 15 minutes.
We had hostilities for 2 days. It was very scary. The windows were shaking. Everything was terrifying. We were very worried about the child, but it was useless. And now we think we will return home soon. We don't want to be here. We're fine here, but we want to go home. We've been waiting for 8 years. Because of this, our guys died, so that Russia would finally recognize us, for us to be Russians, because there's no turning back.
Their opinion of Vladimir Putin's decision here is clear, but no one really knows when they will be able to go back home.
We are glad because he took us, the DNR and LNR. He will be friends with these republics and will help us and raise pensions.
It is reported that more than 90,000 evacuees have arrived in Russia in recent days. They are being accommodated not only here near the border, but also in other regions of the country. Galina Polonskaya, Euronews, Rostov region.
Food prices are already high in EU states such as Greece, and the Ukraine crisis will raise them even higher. Russia has stopped exporting fertilizer to the EU, which will hit wheat production and in turn the price of bread.
The price of 1 loaf was 70 centimes in September, now it's 80. We decided to keep the price as low as possible because we prefer to limit our profit for such an important household product, a product that people need on their table every day. In pastry products, prices are out of control.
Since September, flour has gone up 70%, olive oil 50% and margarine 20%. Our correspondent Semela Tuchtidou says that market experts fear the next conflict between Russia and the West will be on the economic front. The first move was made by President Putin before his announcement on Ukraine. He banned exports of ammonium nitrate, a fertilizer that's vital to grow wheat and produce bread and pasta. And prices on these products are expected to increase further.
The US is slapping sanctions on the company that has built the Russia to Germany Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. It follows Germany's own move, saying it will suspend the controversial project indefinitely. It's in response to Russia's recognition of rebel-held areas of East Ukraine.
Our German allies yesterday took resolute action to ensure that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, what had been a prized $11 billion investment on the part of the Russian Federation, is suspended indefinitely. And as you have just seen, President Biden today authorized sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG and its corporate office holders.
The pipeline, owned by Russia's state-backed energy giant Gazprom, runs from western Siberia to Germany, doubling the capacity of the already in use Nord Stream 1 pipeline. When on stream, it would be a major source of revenue for Moscow. However, that now looks unlikely. Meanwhile, the European Union has adopted its package of sanctions. They target key members of President Putin's inner circle and top businessmen. The individuals will be barred from travelling to the European Union and their financial assets will be frozen. EU leaders are to hold an emergency summit in Brussels today to discuss the Russia-Ukraine crisis.
Donico Bancoyan is a professor of post-Soviet politics at Dublin City University. He told Euronews he doesn't think sanctions will do much to alter the course of the war.
I think it's more or less what was expected, and I think it's more or less what Vladimir Putin would have been expecting. There was a certain degree of bravado earlier this week at the Russian Security Council when Dmitry Medvedev said that they had absorbed sanctions since 2014, because of course the United States and the European Union have had sanctions on Russia since that time, since the annexation of Crimea. And they've absorbed them. They have a large war chest, they have a large amount of savings, and they felt they confidently proclaimed they could absorb sanctions. And of course, don't forget, these sanctions have been by and large signaled in advance. And Putin, knowing what the sanctions would be, more or less still invaded Ukraine today. So I think that sanctions are not going to in any way influence, I think, the course of the war. They might have longer term implications, but this is a war that Russia enjoys complete military superiority, and I think it's not going to have any immediate effect. As I said, these sanctions were more or less anticipated in advance. They will have made preparations. Certainly money will have been diverted in different directions. No, I don't see it. This is now a war, and it's not going to be won by throwing money at the problem right now. It's who has troops on the ground. And one thing that was clear from Joe Biden's speech is that the United States and indeed NATO are not going to commit troops. Ukraine is militarily on its own right now, as it has always been. This has been the dilemma for Ukraine from the very beginning. It has a very powerful and determined adversary in the Kremlin, but relatively irresolute allies. And now we've reached the crunch stage. The fact that Ukraine is not in NATO, is not in the EU, is being underlined. You know, you look at neighboring Estonia. In the neighborhood, it has a population that's smaller than Dublin from where I'm speaking, 1.3 million people. Ukraine has a population 30 times the size of Estonia, but it's Estonians who are sleeping in their beds at night, and it's Ukrainians who are under threat.
Get all the international news you want with the Euronews app. Anytime, anywhere, on all devices. Download the Euronews app now. Get the latest world news from a European perspective.
Welcome back this morning. What we're looking at is the damage of a building in Kiev. Overnight, there have been several blasts in the city, and Ukrainian President Zelensky has confirmed that there have been several missile strikes against the capital. He confirmed this in a national address this morning. The current strike began at 4 a.m. local time. We do not know exactly how many people have been harmed. However, the Kiev mayor of Kiev has said that he estimated around 3 people have been injured, but we don't know for sure. We also have reports that sirens have been heard in the morning in the capital. This has been from multiple journalists on the ground, including local Ukrainian media sources, and Reuters journalists have also reported that they've heard sirens this morning to warn people of strikes. According to AP, Russian forces are on the outskirts of the capital, and the U.S. has reported that Kiev could well be under siege. The Russian forces are estimated to be around 32 kilometers from the capital. That's around 20 miles. Ukraine's foreign minister said that the Russian rocket strikes were the worst Kiev has seen since World War II. We don't know exactly, as I said, how many people are injured in the city, but we do know from yesterday that an estimate in the country as a whole, not Kiev, but the country as a whole, 137 people have died since yesterday, and 316 people were wounded. The Ukrainian President Zelensky said that he and his family will be staying in the capital, despite what he describes as a target against his back, or him as a target number 1 and his family as target number 2. An estimated 100,000 people have already been displaced because of fighting, and we have already reports of people in Poland, Ukrainians who had refugees who have relocated to Poland, and they're currently being welcomed by 8 reception centers that have been placed along that border. Again, these are images of a building in the Ukrainian capital. We'll bring you more as they come throughout the day.
It's Friday, the 25th of February. Good morning, Europe. We'll be bringing you all the news and reactions from Europe and beyond as the conflict unfolds between Western allies and Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. It's our main story today, and here are the latest developments.
Reports of missile fire on Kyiv as Russian forces continue their assault on Ukraine. President Zelensky says the country is alone in the fight. Russia now faces harsh new sanctions from across the globe, with the EU, the US and Britain promising to freeze financial assets. The first wave of Ukrainian refugees arrives in Poland. The UN says Russia's invasion will tear countless lives apart.
After a day of intense Russian attacks, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says at least 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed. There were explosions overnight around Kyiv, although it was impossible for reporters to confirm the origins. Zelensky also said his country felt alone in the fight. We're alone in defending our nation. Who's ready to fight with us? I don't see anybody. Who's ready to give Ukraine a guarantee to join NATO? Everyone is afraid. Ukraine also said Russian infiltrators are in the country. They confirmed Russia seized control of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and some reports say the soldiers are holding the zone's personnel as hostages.
This unlawful and dangerous hostage-taking, which could upend the routine civil service efforts required to maintain and protect the nuclear waste facilities, is obviously incredibly alarming and greatly concerning. We condemn it and we request their release.
In Kyiv and the West, many observers say they don't believe Vladimir Putin will limit his territorial ambitions to Ukraine. While admitting it's difficult to judge his ultimate intentions, Putin maintains he has no choice. What's happening right now are forced measures. We were left with no other way to proceed. But some reports say the Russian army is encountering more resistance than expected. Ukraine, after all, has been preparing for years. The government has ordered every man aged from 18 to 60 to remain in the country to defend the people. The European Council has intensified sanctions on Russia after a meeting on Thursday night. The measures are designed to hit the Russian economy and to persuade Moscow to stop the invasion. Around 70% of banks and state-owned companies are being targeted, and the EU is making the visa system much harder for Russians.
President Putin chose to bring back war to Europe. This is a fully fledged invasion in Ukraine, and this fundamentally puts into question our peace order.
Next question. France's President Emmanuel Macron says the world should keep open negotiating channels with Russia. While condemning, while sanctioning, while continuing to make decisions and acting, we leave this path open so that the day when the conditions can be met, we can obtain a cessation of hostilities for the Ukrainian people.
Pour les Ukrainiennes et pour les Ukrainiens.
Western nations had wanted to cut off Russia from the international banking system known as SWIFT. It's a measure Kyiv would like to see, but they're holding back for now. The US president said it is still an option.
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks have of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take.
But the UK is excluding major Russian banks from its financial system, and oligarchs are under fire in new sanctions announced by Boris Johnson on Thursday. And Japan is freezing the assets of Russian groups, banks and individuals, as well as suspending exports of semiconductors and other sensitive goods to military-linked organisations in Russia. Meanwhile, Australia's Prime Minister is accusing China of throwing Russia a lifeline